Hello and welcome to Game Time. I am Ben, and this is Justin.
Baba Yetu Ye.
And welcome to our very first episode. Over the course of this series, we will be discussing various board games and, if the mood strikes us, video games, and their relation to history. The structure of a general episode will go something like this. We will first introduce the game, talk about how to play, some basic to intermediate strategies for it. We will then start discussing the history of the context of the game, what exactly happened in that time, the actual facts, and then we will move on to how well the game matches up. Today we will be starting with the game Seven Wonders.
By the way, I'll be making a reference every episode, so you have that to look forward to. Anyway, Seven Wonders is a game designed by Antoine Bauza, published by Rebos Production in 2010, and on the website Board Game Geek, it is ranked number 18 out of over 70,000 games, with a rating of 7.88, which is extremely high. So, in Seven Wonders, each player is a city-state where one of the seven wonders of the ancient world was, I guess, allegedly, foreshadowing, constructed. So the game is divided into 3 ages for 3 to 7 players. Each player is given a hand of 7 cards. Now, this is a drafting game, so after you make your selection, you will pass your hand to one of your neighbors. And then they'll have 6 cards, and it keeps going until you're down to 2. Then the age ends, you repeat that 3 times. Whoever has the most points at the end is the winner.
Each card tends to have a basic cost for usage, tending to be either basic or manufactured resources. All this stuff is provided either on your specific city-state's board or on the cards that you previously have played.
Exactly. So you have your basic and processed resources. You have cultural artifacts, statues.
Those give you victory
buildings.
points directly.
You have various commerce cards, which do things relating to money.
Mm-hmm.
You have military cards, which you can use to get points by fighting your neighbors at the end of every round. You have the green cards, which are my favorite color, which give you lots and lots of points, but it's very difficult because it's based on technology, or which are these certain icons. You need to have set collection of the icons to get the highest value of points. There are also variable purple guild cards in the final third age.
The guild cards can have various effects, victory points, gold, military, what have you. And amongst all this, you are trying to build and complete your wonder. Now, each city-state has a specific wonder associated with it. If you're Giza, for example, you're going to be building the pyramids. And for each stage of the wonder that you build, you get certain rewards, be it victory points, gold, military strength, etc.
Now, what makes the game so strategically difficult is that every turn you can either play a card face up for its effect, you could discard it for gold if you need to, or you can use it to build a stage of your wonder. But you have to give up a round, essentially, to build your wonder. So it's very much a game of opportunity costs.
Exactly. So let's move, that's the basic structure of the game. Let's move on now to more of the strategies. You've played it far more than I have.
Yes.
You want to give it a go?
There is a common... I don't know if it's a complaint depending on whether you're on the receiving end or on the drafting end of this, but the technology cards are rather powerful. If you can get them, it's very nice because the points work is that there are 3 different symbols: a compass, a gear, and a tablet of cuneiform, not apples. And for each one of the same you get that many points squared.
So if you have 4 tablets, you get 16 points. You have 5, that moves up to 25.
Which I've done once. It's glorious.
It is very, very difficult. So that kind of, though the technology does kind of highlight a pattern that I've noticed in the game, that specialization does tend to pay off. If you are going, you tend to look for victory points in one specific area, it tends to give better results than if you look for it across all areas. For example, technology, it's a geometric distribution for how many points you get versus how much you invest.
Right. But now, you were going military in the game we just played,
Yeah.
and while I did miscalculate and undervalue my final score, you did get pretty close to beating me.
I did.
You won every single battle. So
I won
that's
every single battle, so that is
18 points?
18 points, yes. So I ended up with 18 points just from that, which put me only one behind you. And for the record, this guy got, what, 31 points total?
It was in the 50s.
It was no, from the technology.
Oh, yeah.
31.
Yeah, about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can rack up points very, very quickly from specializing in a certain area.
I've also seen, it's a little harder to do, but I've also seen people win by the blue cards, the just flat out victory points, which when I first was playing this game, it struck me as one of those traps for new players, like, oh, this looks really good, but oh wait, it's not so good. Like life gain in Magic the Gathering. It sounds great on paper, but typically spells that just say you gain X life are actually really bad unless it's associated with another effect. So
Then we get to building your wonder.
So, I have a question, Ben.
Yes.
Which wonder is your favorite? I think you've only played a couple times.
I've only
but
played a few times. I would
holding
say that my favorite would have to be Halicarnassus, because it allows you to go through the discards and get basically anything that has been discarded throughout the game, which can be pretty powerful if you're playing with many players, as the discards do pile up towards the end.
Yeah. I guess my favorite is... I really like the Lighthouse of Alexandria because it gives you just raw resources. So another thing is, depending on what wonder you are, there's a big difference in when you want to build it. For example, if you can't really play the Halicarnassus until the end game when there's actual cards that have been discarded.
Yeah, you don't want to play it the first round when there is no discard pile for you to look through.
And Alexandria gives you raw resources, so it's very good to get that in advance. And this is a very fun, because if you can manage to get just those two, you get the 2 clay to get the 1 of any kind of resource. And then you can use that and 1 other wood to get the second tier. And then you have
1 of any kind of manufactured resource, which then can also work with the fact that you start with a manufactured resource in Alexandria, which is a bit more powerful than the raw.
Yeah. My other favorite is Babylon, because Babylon not only does it give you free technology of your choice at the end, which by the way is a great math exercise trying to optimize your summing of squares. I really should know how to do this. I've survived calculus, but it's still painful. And then it also gives you the ability to play or discard for points, or coins, excuse me, your final card in your hand. So at the very least, you're getting 3 coins or 1 point.
Yeah.
Because
you essentially get an extra card each age,
Yeah.
if you can get that within the first.
Because also in scoring, when you round down the amount of money you have, and for every 3 coins you have, you get 1 point. So which is a nice catch-up? It's not a catch-up mechanic.
It's just a nice mechanic to get some more points if you happen to play the game on the bit more economic side. I remember the last game we played, I was definitely the resource master.
Yeah.
People were paying me a lot, and I got about 5 victory points from coins alone.
That's impressive. So, now, I've only been in the board gaming hobby for little over a year, but I would say that Seven Wonders is either my 3rd or 4th favorite game. It's very high up there.
Oh, wow.
What about you?
I don't really have a favorites list already, I'll be
Yeah.
perfectly honest. But it is definitely a good, fun strategy game. It can be painful at times because it's all about opportunity costs. If you have a large game with 7 people, you only get to pick 1 card out of the 7, and all the rest you are never going to see again.
We should also warn, this game, for when you're teaching new people, you should it can be very difficult to teach, and there can be a lot of analysis paralysis. When you have everyone knowing exactly what they're doing, this game flies like lightning, only a half hour or so,
Mhm.
which is very quick for most games. But when people aren't sure what they're doing,
It can drag
It
to like an hour and a
drags.
half to maybe 2 hours if you have
gee.
7 players.
yeah,
so
I remember
who are
that game.
all
It wasn't
rookies.
that bad, was it? Or-
No, I think it was a half hour.
Really close.
It was an hour and a half, my bad.
Yeah.
I misspoke. All right. So let's move on to the history surrounding the Seven Wonders. So, upon research, it seems that the ancient Greeks invented the listicle long before BuzzFeed was ever a thing. They had famous lists of the greatest poets, lists of the greatest playwrights, and in this case, greatest architectural achievements.
And Ben isn't just trying to make a cutesy comparison. He's pretty accurate. The Seven Wonders of the world. Well, was no one definitive list. It was many Greek poets and historians writing what they considered to be the 7 greatest sites that were made by man in their world, as in the Mediterranean.
Mostly the Eastern Mediterranean. There wasn't much architecture going on in Western Europe or Western Africa until much later.
Right. So the first main version of this list was by a poet named Antipater of Sidon. Sidon is a city in Lebanon in around 140 BCE, which, interesting to note, in this version, the Ishtar Gate replaced the Lighthouse of Alexandria.
The Ishtar Gate was this grand gate, essentially, within the walls of Babylon. Apparently, it could hold, according to reports, it could hold 2 big 4-horse, I think it was 4-horse
that's what
chariots.
Paul
Yes,
mentioned.
and they would hold chariot races through the gate because it was so large.
So actually, it might be a good idea to just quickly mention all 7 wonders.
Yes, so the list from the beginning was Pyramids of Giza, Colossus of Rhodes, the Ishtar Gate Walls of Babylon, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the Temple of Artemis, and the Statue of Zeus.
Later, the Lighthouse of Alexandria eclipsed the Ishtar Gates of Babylon, knocking it off the traditional 7 wonder list. So, Ben, I have a question for you.
Yes.
One of these things is not like the others. Which one am I thinking of?
I'm going to guess the Hanging Gardens.
Really? Now, why would that be?
Because it's generally considered to be the only one that didn't really exist.
Yeah. So, this is interesting. So, Babylon it's essentially modern day, it was ancient Baghdad. Baghdad was built right outside the ruins of Babylon in the 800s, I believe. So, according to the legend, Nebuchadnezzar II built these hanging gardens as a gift for his wife, the Queen Amytis, who missed the more verdant lands of around the Caspian Sea in modern-day Iran. Now, there are many reasons why this has a few problems. So, one of which, Nebuchadnezzar II was definitely real. His wife was real, and he built a lot of industrial projects. And he kept a lot of records about this for his own...
Personal record keeping use,
Yes.
as big cities are wont to do.
and for his own posterity's gratification. He never mentioned any gardens, let alone a giant 100-foot-tall garden.
The second problem lies in the technology. The pumps required to lift the water high enough simply weren't around when the gardens were supposedly built.
Really? Because
There were screw pumps
Right.
and such, but it would require a massive amount of manual, constant labor, considering the reported size of these gardens.
No, I saw a theory that the gardens existed, but simply not in Babylon. Did you find in your research a reference to the king Sennacherib of Nineveh?
No, I actually haven't. I have heard records of various gardens being in extents in existence, in Nineveh, but not the Hanging Gardens specifically.
So the theory goes that the records that were written, by the way, the important thing to realize, Nebuchadnezzar lived from the reigned from 605 to 562 BCE. So keep in mind that even when these lists were being compiled, the Hanging Gardens were centuries old, or would have been centuries old. So this was essentially ancient history even to them. This would be like if we were trying to do a report on what Constantinople was like before it fell to the Turks in the 1450s. That's how long ago we're dealing with here.
Give or take a couple centuries.
Yes. I was a little off with that. Anyway, but unlike Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib kept extensive records detailing his accomplishments with gardens. That was one of his favorite kinds of public projects. He promoted a lot of irrigation, a lot of gardens throughout his capital, which was around where Mosul is in northern Iraq today, and gathering exotic plants. So it is possible that, in fact, he was the one who built the gardens, and that posterity simply misunderstood the wording, such as Babylon and the Hanging Gardens, as it could have referred to a general area, and it's slightly ambiguous.
It is. Also, modern archaeological research has yet to actually uncover any garden of the scope that these ancient Greek historians were referencing.
Although it is certainly possible that it would be difficult to distinguish it from any other ziggurat.
That's true. That is very true.
However, with the exception of the pyramids, which still stands, that was actually what I was thinking of, all of the wonders' archaeological remains, or some of them, have been found. So all the others are known for certain to have existed. So actually, let's go back to that. But going back to the pyramids, the other one of these things is not like the others. So we've all heard of the Great Pyramid. We've all heard possibly interesting things about the pyramid. So the pyramids were constructed by a pharaoh named Khufu, or rather by workers of the pharaoh named Khufu, in around 2500 BCE. It was the tallest man-made structure on Earth until the Lincoln Cathedral was completed in England in 1311.
Yes, the Great Pyramids were a good 3,000 years old when Rome was falling, and it has been only, 1,600 years since Rome fell? 1,500?
I think, yes. Yes.
So, to be perspective, the pyramids were around twice as long as it has been since Rome fell, when Rome was at its peak.
Polaris wasn't actually the North Star when the pyramids were built. That's how old they are. Also interesting, the pyramids, will they survive? They've seen better times. So when the pyramids were built, their whole surface was coated in limestone. So there was this gorgeous reflective white sheen on the pyramids, tapped with a gold or gold-silver alloy covered pyramid at the top. And of course, the pyramid was filled with untold treasures for Khufu and his wife to take to the afterlife. Those didn't really last. So the reason in the old kingdom of ancient Egypt, pharaohs were seen as literal gods on earth, and massive pyramids were built in their honor. As Egypt progressed, they built still equally incredible and beautiful tombs, but they were more subtle, more hidden, more low-key, because
less prone to grave robbing, in other words. If you have a giant tomb that you announce is going to be filled with treasures upon treasures upon treasures, and it happens to be the largest man-made structure on Earth at that time, covered in glistening white marble and topped with literal gold. Right, so let's move on to the
Colossus of Rhodes.
Yes, there were records of Emperor Nero taking pieces of the previously collapsed, but still historically important Colossus back to Rome and using them as sort of tourist attractions.
Colossus has a very tragic, it's sort of the red shirt of the Seven Wonders. It was built in 280 BC, or finished in 280 BCE, to celebrate the victory of a siege of Rhodes. Rhodes is one of the islands in Greece.
In case you were ever wondering about possible inspirations for Game of Thrones, Braavos was Rhodes. In case that gives you any context.
Interesting. So the statue was bronze reinforced with iron inside. It was over 100 feet tall. It lasted about 60 years. It was the final of the Seven Wonders to be built and the first to collapse. It went down in an earthquake, which caused some pretty extensive damage to the city.
Yeah.
But it was still actually a major tourist attraction.
Still was.
And then there's the legend of what happened to the ruins. So the story goes that after Muslim conquerors briefly took control of Rhodes, they considered the Colossus an idol, melted it down, and sold the scrap to a Jewish merchant in Iraq. Now, this is almost so stereotypical, and you have to consider it was written by a very zealous Christian member of the Byzantine court. It's almost certainly not true.
But it does make a fine just so story for why there aren't any remnants of it left
Yes.
in Rhodes. There is evidence of its base, however,
Correct.
still standing, if not the copper itself.
And because it was between the Muslim conquest of Rhodes and its collapse, that was a good 800 years. So plenty of stuff could have been taken in that time. But Colossus was actually the main inspiration for the Statue of Liberty, so its influence still goes on today.
All right, we're running a bit short on time, so we're gonna have to go a little quicker through the final ones.
All right, so which one do you think is the most interesting?
I would say the most interesting would be the lighthouse.
Yeah, probably the most important one in terms of economic impact, because this one was not...
It wasn't included in
wasn't
the
a
original
vani-
list,
it
and it
wasn't
wasn't
a
a
vanity
vanity project
project.
either. No, it was a legitimate architectural achievement that was used for a specific purpose.
So
A lighthouse.
right, and actually one of the world's first, because Alexandria it's a port city for Egypt, its main port, and during this time it was actually the capital of Egypt. And this lighthouse, it used a massive mirror by day, a flame by night, and this actually was, I think, the second longest lasting wonder. It went from 280 BCE to all the way used into the 1300s when it was heavily damaged by earthquakes, and then in 1480 the Sultan, or I believe he was called the Caliph of Egypt, finally just took the rather meager remains and used it for a fort. There was not much left at that time. But this is actually one where in the 90s an archaeologist actually discovered most of the remains in Alexandria's harbor that were sent there by the earthquake. We have the Mausoleum of Mausolus, whose name he was given to mausoleums today. A Persian governor of what's now Turkey.
Yes.
Extremely intricate.
Very, very
True.
huge. It wasn't actually built by the guy, it was built by his wife.
Yes.
Shockingly, in those times they would ever allow a woman gasp to hold any sort of political power.
Persians were better at that than the Greeks were.
That is very true. That is very, very true.
And like most of the others, it was destroyed by earthquakes and then finally used for fortifications when there wasn't much left. So the one I find most interesting is the statue of Zeus.
Yes, 40 feet tall, gold, ivory, wood statue. It was in the city-state of Olympia.
Which you might know for reasons. But it was truly awe-inspiring. I mean,
It was this imagine the Lincoln Memorial, but made of ivory and gold.
and a god.
And being a god, yes, that's true. So, not that Lincoln isn't badass enough as it
No.
is, he lacks the power, sadly, to throw lightning bolts at anyone who displeases him.
And I'm imagining the political power Olympia must have garnered with this statue would have been enormous.
Well, the fact that this statue existed in Olympia is evidence enough. You have to
Yeah.
have an enormous amount of political and economic power in order to commission such a huge, obscenely expensive statue.
Speaking of which, this leads into a very interesting story of the final fate of the statue. A eunuch from the Byzantine Empire by the name of Lansis acquired the 40-foot gold and ivory statue of Zeus and had it installed in his palace. And then in the late 400s, his palace also burnt down, which resulted in the statue's destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Just to cover the Temple of Artemis, speaking of arson, that was really mean of me.
Oh,
so,
yes.
Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which is in Turkey, essentially similar to the Parthenon in design, except grander and a lot more art.
Mm-hmm.
It actually, the interesting thing is we think of tourism as a modern thing, but, well, the Seven Wonders were intended to be, hey, visit these places.
Visit these places. We have very cool stuff. The Temple of Artemis was no exception. It was huge temple, and basically was Ephesus's, I don't want to say only claim to fame, but it was a major claim to fame.
But what's interesting is I found conflicting reports on the exact dimensions, but the one thing that I found consistent was its height. It was 60 feet tall, held by 127 columns. Every source I read, exactly 127 columns, exactly 60 feet high. I just thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, it's very rare that you get such definitive reports and such consistent reports of dimensions for historical especially ancient architectural achievements, because people like to, let's say, embellish
or lie that they've been there. That was
that was a huge thing.
Anyway, speaking of the arson, so the temple was actually in the year, and it's sometimes thought of in legends as the very night Alexander the Great was born, burnt down by a fame-seeking person who just wanted the infamy. It was later rebuilt, and then Alexander was born around 350 BCE, and it survived, rebuilt completely, a testament to the wealth of the city, and survived into the 200s, where it was destroyed by the Goths in their numerous invasions of the Roman Empire. And with that, I suppose we shall go to the game and the history. About how the history meshes with the game, and I have an anecdote about this. So, my younger brother got this game for Hanukkah several years ago, and when I got into the board gaming hobby, I found this game unplayed in our house, and I was looking through it, and I love history, and I was looking through all these cards. I was getting the chills. I was excited to play this game, and I think the artwork, the art by Miguel Coimbra, I'm very sorry to have mispronounced your name, did an amazing job with the art. It's beautiful, especially with the wonder boards. It's very evocative of ancient times.
It gives you the feeling of grandeur. It gives you the feeling of, again, like ancient, powerful, all that lovely, delicious stuff we like to see in artwork. The artwork also is incredibly detailed. They made time to draw each of the windows for every single house and the aerial view from the torch of Colossus of Rhodes. And
Yes.
that is just something that should be mentioned and celebrated.
Yes.
While the art is very good at creating the feel for the game, in terms of historical accuracy, is not necessarily the greatest. Again, with the Colossus of Rhodes card.
Yes. We're not going to nitpick, but the Colossus, so since the Middle Ages, the Colossus has been depicted as standing, his legs spread out with boats passing underneath, entering, and exiting Rhodes' port. Now, there are many things wrong with this. One, there's no record of it standing that way. Two, engineers have determined that given the materials and structure used at the time, it would have almost immediately collapsed under its own weight. Just the stance would not have been able to support the massive bronze and iron body. Also, in the event of a collapse, it would have, in this case, completely blockaded Rhodes' port, which we know didn't happen when it did collapse. It was still a viable port for the centuries afterward. The other thing is, it was possible that in such a stance, that anyone entering or leaving the city might have been being flashed by a giant bronze statue. It was the ancient Greeks. They did stuff like that.
Yes. They also, within some of the guild cards, they show people playing what appears to be Dungeons and Dragons.
I thought it was Magic the Gathering as well.
Magic the Gathering?
But that's...
Look, you see there's some dice right over there?
Yeah, that is nice. Oh, of course, to be fair, this card is almost definitely a loving tribute to everything. It's called the Gamers Guild. It's from one of the expansions, and it's a clear love letter to everything involving geek hobbies.
Yes.
Including his the playtesting group, the sombrero wearing Belgians, which is
that is definitely true. But even within the main game, aside from the expansions, there are some inaccuracies. For example, the Palace card looks to be just a recolored Taj Mahal, which, if you don't know, the Taj Mahal was built in the 1400s by the Mughals in India.
Using Muslim architecture, and just for a reminder, Muhammad was born in 570 CE. This minarets didn't appear until like a century or two after his death.
Yes, and so, needless to say, some of the architecture doesn't necessarily mesh well with Bronze Age.
We have some Arab and Roman influences in
as well as some surprisingly Gothic ones, for example, in the Laboratory card.
Yes, this card I genuinely don't understand. The Scientists Guild, it appears to be a very Gothic-looking building with glowy, like green radioactive glowy bits.
Again, hits the feel quite nicely, not so much on the accuracy.
Yes.
Moving on to more literal aspects of the game, you wanted to talk a bit about the science?
Yeah, so one of it is abstracted, but the green technology cards are a big part of the game, and I'm glad they're there, because for any game that covers the wide survey of history, be it board games or video games, I'm mainly thinking of Civ 4. What's the point of the Ancient Age? It's to either conquer stuff when the technology is low, or to get as much technology as possible and leave the ancient times. But the thing is, the Greeks and the Egyptians and all those people, they were doing a lot of technological innovation. You have the beginnings of... You have very prototypical algebra. Mm-hmm. You have the beginnings of chemistry. You have the beginnings of astronomy, philosophy, of course.
Yes.
And you even have strange things like the Antikythera mechanism, which was this very intricate copper machine found at the bottom of the ocean.
Oh, yes, I remember this.
No
one knows really what it's for.
It's some kind of calendar, fancy calendar.
That's the leading theory.
But it's hundreds of interlocking gears with this very precise calendar marking the Olympics and gods decorating it. So all those ancient cultures, science and technology were a big thing, and I'm glad that's represented in the game, however abstracted.
Yes, it is important to emphasize this, as it is all too easy to imagine technology at kind of a standstill until the 20th century. Speaking of things being at a standstill, this game definitely, in my opinion, epitomizes the international dynamic of the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean quite perfectly. Things were definitely not at a standstill.
Now, of the 7 cities, how many of them were on the Mediterranean? There was Alexandria, Ephesus was Halicarnassus?
Yes, they were
Rhodes
all
and
of them.
Olympia was very close.
They were all either on the Mediterranean actual or very, very close to the Mediterranean. Or
Giza was accessible down the Nile. Babylon's the only one that was distant, and that had the Tigris and the Euphrates.
that is the Tigris and the Euphrates. But more importantly, the fact remains that each of these were their own city-state. Now, yes, there were some empires in that era, Egypt, the Hittite Empire, but the fact remains that these structures were not quite the powerful nations that we're used to thinking of today. The geopolitics at the time was really, really defined by the city-state, even if those city-states were within, technically, a larger empire. And you see that in the structure of the game. Each player gets their own city-state, even if those city-states are technically part of the same empire. For example, you have the pyramids and you have the lighthouse, Giza and Alexandria competing against each other, which is important. Also, the trade.
Yes.
The trade is key. I keep using the phrase international, but that's not really right, because there were no nationals, there were no nations, nothing to be national, and C, because it can be thought the entire Mediterranean Bronze Age system can be thought of a single, constantly warring, but a single civilization nevertheless. There was an enormous amount of interconnectivity, an enormous amount of exchange of goods and materials, and yes, spears and arrows. I have heard people compare the interconnectivity to what globalization was back in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. You have this really interconnected, interwoven society, the likes of which we don't really see.
They were constantly falling in and out of political unions. You had the Mycenaeans really far back. You had the Persian Empire. You had Alexander's Empire. You had the remnants of Alexander's Empire.
Yeah,
Rome rising over the centuries.
Over the centuries, you had tons and tons and tons of ebb and flow, and it really creates this really nice system that works pretty well, because each of the city-states, their governments didn't really control much what trade went on, what interchange went on, with the exception of the military. You see that in this game. If someone wants to buy something from you, you cannot say no. They just give you the money and they buy it. They did, however, control the military, and that is
the basis of, well, I guess you could say that's the basis of all society, as in I remember reading that sovereignty is the legal right to use violence.
At least it certainly was back in
even in
Bronze
Age
Age time.
of either dealing out punishment for crimes or a police force.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And they're always falling in and out of political unions, falling in and out of war. Around the classical period of the Seven Wonders, you had Alexander had just died. His empire, Ptolemy, had taken over Egypt. Greece, Turkey, Middle East, they were all falling into their own things, and would essentially remain that way until Rome really, under Caesar and his immediate predecessors.
Yes.
If I remember correctly.
So, final verdict. Historically accurate or not so much?
It's hard to say. I mean, there is the license to abstraction that's
art
afforded to any games, and then there's artistic license. But still, I really like the historical feel of this game. It is largely because of the art, but the art is just so evocative, and the basic mechanisms, the basic things you do, trading, innovating, warring, resources, building those wonders, it really provides the feel of that time. And it's one of my favorite games, and the historicalness is a major reason why. What about you, Ben?
Absolutely. Again, art technically may not be that accurate, but the actual game system, the way that the players play the game is so is so accurate in depicting how these city-states related to one another that I have to say absolutely historically accurate.
All right. Excellent. Well, you can catch us again in 2 weeks' time. We'll be talking about another game and another time period.
All right. Thank you very much for listening to Game Time. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.